Welcome to our oral evidence session in public of the Education Select Committee this morning. This is an evidence session on our inquiry solving the SEND crisis. I'm going to ask our witnesses this morning to introduce yourselves briefly to the committee, if you would, starting with Catherine.
Hi, I'm Catherine McLeod. I'm the Chief Executive of Dingley's Promise. We support children with SEND in the early years.
Hello, I'm Annamarie Hassall and I'm Chief Exec at nasen, which is the National Association for Special Educational Needs. And we're a membership organisation drawing membership from the education workforce.
Morning, Margaret Mulholland, SEND and Inclusion Policy Specialist from the Association of School and College Leaders.
Good morning, I'm Clare Howard, I'm Chief Executive of Natspec. We're the membership body for 137 specialist colleges, and we also train the workforce across mainstream, general further education and other FE providers.
Lovely, thank you. Can I start our questioning with some questions on the SEN support provision in mainstream schools? And I think perhaps this question might be less relevant to you, Clare, because you're concerned with colleges rather than schools, but do come in if you'd like to. Can I ask our other witnesses, what is your assessment of the current provision of SEN support in mainstream schools? Perhaps starting with Margaret.
Thank you. Well, I think we're extremely worried about the situation, the current situation. School and college leaders tell us that it's not working in terms of the resource they're receiving in order to support the young people that they serve. So many issues with the current system that we could list, and I think we're all aware of, but particularly around the sort of lack of consistency, the unhelpful bureaucracy, the inconsistencies around magnet schools and provision in local areas being inconsistent, so not just nationally but locally, the pressure on schools to reduce numbers on registers, the lack of funding coming direct to the classroom. So those are the things we're really concerned about. But we do think there's a lot of brilliant work being done in the system, and we're really excited about the commitment to inclusion and the opportunity to build on the expertise that exists already. And I think that's one of the messages I'd really like to share today, is that we've got some good practice out there. We need further resource to embed and build on the shoulders of some of that expertise.
Thank you. Annamarie.
So I'd really welcome an opportunity to add there that for the past 3 years plus, nasen has been involved on behalf of the Department for Education in delivering a universal SEND services programme, which is intended to reach schools and colleges to really build on and improve their confidence and SEND support. So we've got a really good picture of the overall SEND landscape, and I think I would say the top point and concern there is the inconsistencies around the country, and that there really is a mixed portfolio of engagement with skills development and training, which then can mean a very mixed portfolio of support for children in schools. And every school is required to have a SENCO, and there's a prescribed form of training for that SENCO, but the SENCO isn't enough on their own. Many years ago, when that role was actually first established, it was quite a different picture in schools. So we have a single person who is really seeking to lead on SEND within their school and to influence all of the practitioners and the practice. So I think that's a challenge. We've got this leader with a very key role, and we've got a bit of a mixed range of commitment from other teachers within school, and I'm really referring to mainly mainstream. And you will know as a committee about the changes that we've had across the education system, the increased academisation. So we have some multi-academy trusts that do some exceptional standout work around inclusion, and we have others that really are focusing on maybe their GCSE exam results in secondary, because they are taking on schools where there's a need for improvement. They're not necessarily seeing SEND as core to school improvement. And we would say, if we can get the provision right for learners with SEND needs, then it doesn't leave anybody else out. In fact, if you set that as the gold standard, it can really create a very inclusive opportunity right the way across school. And if I could, I know we've got a lot of questions, so if I just very quickly say that aside from what's happening in school, there is dependency on other services outside of school. So the speech and language therapists, health provision, that is really crucial. And again, this is where we've got a bit of a mixed arrangement across the country. And then schools seek to compensate if that isn't readily available in the area. So you can find that a teaching assistant, for instance, will take on more health support before they can even begin to support learning, because there isn't necessarily some school nursing or similar other provision, occupational therapists and others. So it's just an example of, it's not a one position for all. There's some standout practice and there's some real areas of challenge and concern, and it's not all at the door of the schools and the colleges. It is very much down to other public services in the area too.
Thank you. Catherine, and then I'll bring Clare. Yeah.
So I suppose when you think about schools, because we'll talk about early years later, but thinking about schools, I think what we haven't done up until now, and we're doing better now, is to really understand the value and the importance of the early years for children with SEND as they feed into schools. That relationship between schools and early years is not particularly strong in some areas, and the early years as a sector is fairly undervalued. Feel very much that they work really well actually with children with SEND. The early years is our best chance to have full inclusion, and that's what we really should be driving for. Where that's the possibility, that needs to be there for all the children and the families have the confidence to then say, when we move into school, we're confident to move into a mainstream school. Sometimes when that's not valued, you end up with a situation where more children are looking to go to special education, so more families are looking to go to special education simply because they don't trust the system. So I think when you look at schools, that valuing of the early years, and also from local authorities, really valuing the numbers from the early years, the statistics, who's coming through. We need to start our pipeline earlier, which will then benefit our schools, so we know which children are coming through and we can support them effectively.
Thank you. Clare.
Just very briefly on FE, one of the main differences between colleges and schools is SEND support. There's no equivalent to the notional £6,000 in colleges. I know that the committee heard quite a lot about the high needs funding formula in your last evidence session. Yeah. The other formula you need to be aware of is the 16 to 19 national funding formula, and there's no reference to SEND within that, which makes it very difficult for colleges, and they are performing miracles despite that. Given the large number of SEND learners in colleges, nearly 30% of 16 to 18-year-olds and 18% of adults. So I think it's urgent that some sort of SEND support funding does arrive in colleges.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. So just turning to kind of what can be done, I've got two more questions before I hand to colleagues. The first is just about what can be done immediately. So based on your experience of good practice, and it is good to hear and to be reminded of all of the expertise that there is within the sector, what could the government do immediately to help the situation in mainstream education settings as far as sort of quality and consistency of support goes?
I think one of the things that we're really anxious about is the fact that where there is good practice, it's in pockets across the country and it's not rolled out. So even yesterday I was in Liverpool, they were talking about the impact that ELSAs have made to school provision, so emotional literacy support staff, and that there's no sustainable funding to take that forward. Multiple examples like that, really effective practice. So I think sustaining good practice is one thing that we can be doing. But I think more fundamental to that, we're hearing from teachers that actually, rather than training is really important. They need time. They need time to embed some of this training and engage in it effectively. We're also really concerned fundamentally that any short-term fixes, and there are 40 of them I could list, but they are in the short term, and what we really need is a system redesign so that that money has traction when it reaches the classroom. At the moment, schools are actually dependent on top-up funding rather than core funding for young people, and we need to change that imbalance. We're actually using some of the top-up funding to maintain the staff that are needed to support with young people's needs. So how have we got to a situation like that where we've got 1 in 5 children with special educational needs in school, but we haven't got the provision and the funding enabling us to do that universal provision really well, and that's what's escalating the demand for EHCPs.
Yeah, if I could add, Margaret's referenced education, health and care plans there. We would really advocate for a shift in how funding is allocated to make sure that that support can be funded earlier. So we're really talking about the phase that we refer to as SEN support, or even earlier than that, by thinking about the whole school environment being more inclusive from the outset. So a language-rich environment, an environment that is appropriate for neurodiverse learners, with attention to acoustics, to lighting, and so on, so that we do as much as possible to prevent some of those barriers from arising. That is easier said than done, because it is the funding that is often holds the key to being able to get in any additional support or have some additional staff time. So tackling the funding, it's not necessarily more funding, it's freeing up the funding and a presumption that it will be possible to buy into the resource, and that will be, if it's a speech and language therapist, if it's specialist resource, that will come through where possible the public sector to maximise the use of funds rather than it being independent resource, which is often more costly.
Thank you.
So from an early years point of view, certainly one of the key things that we need to see is really strong inclusion training across our whole sector, so making sure that that reaches all practitioners, not just SENCOs, but actually all practitioners, so that everybody understands, which reassures families as well as reassuring practitioners. It's also about, as I said, it's our best chance for inclusion for everyone, so actually it's about that really strong ordinarily available provision, so knowing what every setting should be offering and making sure that every setting is using a graduated approach, so assess, plan, do, review. If they're using those strategies, we would say that actually those earliest years should not be focused on getting an EHCP or those processes. Actually, what we've been looking at more recently is saying, could that be shifted into reception, and really looking at properly funding the early years to say that any child in the early years will get what they need without needing to go for a diagnosis at that stage. That's something that we think would really help with sort of giving every child what they need early, and again moving away from, oh well, this child is a child with SENS so they get this, and this child is another child and they get that. Actually we have the opportunity to say in the early years every child is individual and the support is there, it just needs to be funded properly.
Okay.
And then just 2 quick things from me in terms of further education. Firstly, we're delighted that you have got another inquiry on FE and skills, and that's the key one in terms of your question. Because unless that inquiry and unless all of FE and skills policy properly considers the full breadth of SEND learners, not just those that are moving on to employment or on higher level academic courses, we won't get the inclusive approach and some of the approaches that you've been talking about. And I'd agree with colleagues what they said about what's needed in terms of training and in terms of graduated approach. But in order to do that, FE and skills policy has to properly consider SEND. It's been a policy gap at the moment, sort of fallen in between FE and skills policy and SEND policy. 0 to 25 tends to neglect 16 to 25, FE and skills tends to neglect the broad range of SEND. And then secondly, really quickly, it's got to be a system-wide vision of inclusion in order that there's a real clear role for specialist provision within that, in terms of supporting the mainstream and in terms of sufficiency planning across mainstream and special. We're lucky in further education that 90% of EHCP holders are already in the mainstream, general further education or other mainstream providers, only 10% in special, which is right in terms of balance, but in order to make it real inclusion in terms of breaking down that binary system and helping those colleges work together in order to provide better training, I think we need a much greater recognition of an inclusive system with that mix and balance.
Thank you. And then just briefly, and we've got lots of questions to get through, so if I can encourage you to be as succinct as you can be in responding. The government has placed a huge emphasis on inclusion in mainstream in everything that they've said about SEN so far. If we are to see genuine inclusion, if we're to see an improvement in SEN support and ordinarily available provision in mainstream settings, what is the shift in resource that is needed to achieve that kind of meaningful improvement that we want to see?
I think we'd like to see a writing off of local authority debt, so that actually the money going into the system now, the huge amounts of money, are actually reaching the schools and the classrooms in the local area in a way that actually will make the significant difference we need. Again, going back to, if we really want an inclusive model with the universal provision and the ordinarily available there as standard, then we need to address the national funding formula. It must change. We estimate that at 2024 prices, the commission place funding should be at around 13,500. What we know is if that core funding increases, we will have that access to that ordinarily available provision more readily for all children. If we've got 1/5 of young people on the SEND register in school, it should be standard practice, shouldn't it? But we have a system that's still designed on an old model of minority grouping. And I think one really important point is that we need to fund implementation of change, and we haven't done that very effectively in the past. And the other aspect of that, I think the IFS report said to expand core provision, will need significant investment, not just funding, and instead actually said double funding in the first instance to get the system mobilised and working. So significant amounts of funding, but going to that whole school approach, as well as protecting that additional provision needed for young people with exceptional needs.
Thank you. Annamarie.
If I could add, to really address the curriculum and assessment, primarily in mainstream school, because we know that significant numbers of learners disengage from education because the curriculum doesn't appear to match their skills, their talents, and assessment isn't really highlighting what they can do, it just highlights what they can't. And we know that those that are counted as electively home educated, so 117,000 now, includes a significant number with SEND needs. So the curriculum and assessment is already under review, so I would just say be brave and make those changes. Don't dilute standards. It's important to have standards for all our learners and for the future of the country and, you know, talent, employment and so on. But we have to have a curriculum that is more flexible, that is broader, and that enables school leaders to make decisions about what really works for their learner population, to bring in creativity, movement, and within that, opportunities for teachers to be able to reflect and to talk with each other. We've got examples of great peer-to-peer models where that has driven change and improvement and embedding of small steps or big ideas that have made a difference for inclusion.
Thank you. Catherine.
So from a financial point of view, we absolutely believe that there needs to be that value and recognition of the early years. And traditionally as a country, we've invested much less in our early years than our statistical neighbours. So what we know is by the end of the early years, you can fairly accurately predict what children are going to achieve at age 16, so at their GCSEs. So what we really need to do is to pull, especially high needs block funding, in lots of our local, so I shouldn't say lots, in some of our local authorities we're hearing that leadership of the local authorities are saying high needs block is not for early years. And what we really, really need to do is realise that actually that high needs block funding does need to be ring-fenced for the early years because it's not happening everywhere. And that really leads to a situation where we don't intervene early, children are seen later, it costs more, and we need to now be brave and say, let's invest in the early years now to get that early intervention in, so that actually in later years we will start to save money on that. So please look at investing and ring-fencing the percentage of children in the early years who need that support, so that that money goes into the early years.
Thank you, Claire.
And just really briefly, two things. The proportionality of funding. There's 27% of EHCP holders are aged between 16 and 25, and 10% of the high needs budget is attracted to those learners. And there's around 1% of the last high needs capital provision went to FE and early years combined. So we're not getting the proportionalities right there in terms of spread across 0 to 25. But importantly for FE, the localised system makes it very difficult, and a greater sense of regional or national planning. High needs learners are the only learners in FE that are funded locally. Everything else is planned policy funding nationally or through the combined authorities. So I think that collaboration and that type of planning is really important as well.
Thank you. Manuela.
Thank you, Chair. We have heard calls for putting SEN support on a statutory footing. In your view, would this help improve provision in mainstream education settings, and what should this look like in practice? Should we start? Catherine?
I can, yes. So again, from an early years point of view, what I often see in local authorities is that it's the EHCPs that's tracked because it's statutory. So when you look at data and statistics in local authorities, you often don't have that for children on SEN support. So we're missing out on that huge number of children and that pipeline of need. So I think that it's absolutely vital that we do look at SEN support in the same way as we look at EHCPs. However, what we don't want to do is to create a big system. What I would say again in the early years is it is all about what are the needs of all the children, making sure we have funding to be able to provide that for those children, and not about labelling or sort of a large EHCP style system. It's more about making sure that it exists for all children, and that we can give them the support they need at the earliest time without having to jump through lots and lots of hoops. And most local authorities have their systems for SENIF already. What I would say is that SENIF is one of those areas, SEND inclusion funding, is one of those areas in the early years where we need more structure and support from central government. And a lot of local authorities have been talking about, can we have more in the way of standard formats and standard ways of doing this for SENIF, for ordinarily available provision, for childcare sufficiency assessments. Everyone's trying to do the same work at the moment, and they're really calling out for more guidance from government around what looks good, so that they can then manage it in the same way. And then when we look across local authority areas, when children move, when staff move, if the systems are much more similar than they are now, that will also significantly help.
So while there could be positives in defining SEN support as a statutory aspect of what happens in school life, it could bring an unintended consequence of driving then a criteria for accessing that support. Whereas really in an ideal world we should be quite fluid with that support, and viewing that all learners may need some support at some time, and that it's fluid, and that it's not a set, once it's defined it sticks, so that there could be an unintended consequence there, and unless we have got a means by which we could generate additional funding and resources and so on, if it's doing more with the same, then I really think we might have to guard against what could result in a bit of a tick box approach. I would rather we took the philosophy of an inclusion right the way across the board approach and really work hard to define what that is. And colleagues have referenced ordinarily available provision, so being clear about the expectations for all schools and for all settings and what should be there in every school, not as an added extra. I would prefer the effort went in there than defining SEN support as a statutory phase.
Yeah, I'd endorse that from Annamarie completely, but I'd also ask the question, you know, how would it differ from what we have now? We have a statutory expectation to meet needs. We're really struggling to achieve that, and we're struggling to see those outcomes. So if, as we say, it's about being more intentional and more accountable for funding and additional funding, then that might bring some short-term benefits, because that funding might be ring-fenced and more accountable. But actually, if it's not there, what we want to be accountable for is the quality of provision, not if we can provide it. And I think we're literally at a point of assessing whether we can or can't actually achieve that universal provision at the moment. So that's really got to shift. And I think also we're at risk of pathologising again and saying, if we make statutory around SEND support, we are really worried about SEND support. You know, EHCP has a lens and a focus and a support system that's working to a degree. We still are really worried about the lack of specialist support in relation to young people who have educational healthcare plans. But those on SEND support are not getting that broader universal provision. So what we don't want to be doing is saying, right, we're going to ring-fence funding and we're going to pathologise that all over again. These children are different and they need something different. As Annamarie said, we actually need schools that are fit for purpose, and these young people are a particularly important focus within our school core funding.
I can understand the calls for putting SEND support on a statutory footing, because children and young people without EHCPs aren't getting the support they require, and that feels like a natural suggestion. I'd agree with my colleagues, however, that it's not a magic bullet. Just creating a statutory framework doesn't mean that it will happen, as we've seen with the unlawful practice that's happening in other areas of the system. As I've already mentioned, that colleges don't get any funding for students without EHCPs. There's nothing in the formula for that. So I think it's necessary to do, as my colleagues have said, get the support in place, put the training in place, and provide an accountability measures that make sense, and let's measure the right things in terms of outcomes.
Thank you. Jess.
Thank you. We know that waiting times for EHCPs are too long, with only 50% issued within the 20-week target. What additional support can education settings offer to parents, carers and young people while they're waiting for these plans to be processed and finalised?
Should I take that? Yes, well, schools are often waiting an awful long time, as you know, and they're doing their best to put provision in place without waiting for that EHCP. However, where there is additional intervention required, whilst trying to use economies of scale, that's not always possible. There's not always access to those specialists that are needed. So actually, what schools are telling us they're doing is they're trying to meet need by pooling resource, looking at alternatives in terms of, online provision for acute needs. We're particularly worried about children with mental health conditions at the moment. Young people are 7 times more likely to have a mental health condition, and actually really ensuring that they can be in school, engaging with the learning, is proving incredibly challenging. Access to an educational psychologist, access to CAMS is not available in that period. So bringing families in, working with them closely, making sure that we're constantly in touch with them, encouraging the LA to do the same and making sure there are helplines available. A number of LAs are working with schools to make sure that they can release funding early working through clusters. And we've got examples of Camden, Croydon and many others. I was hearing this week about Birmingham, where they've got provision plans that are releasing funding early so that we're not waiting for the completion of the EHCP. So during that needs assessment period, it's really important that families are getting what they need, professionals are getting what they need. We need a single point of contact at the local authority, and we need that team around the family still supported in the interim period. So lots of innovation in that space, but again, we need those timelines to be tighter. We need less bureaucracy. Schools are often making a needs assessment, completing the needs assessment to the local authority, but then having it rejected and having to go back through that bureaucratic process all over again. It feels often it's because the escalation of demand for EHCPs is a huge pressure for those local authorities to bear, so that pressure comes back into school. There's pushback, and then instead of being able to use our capacity to focus on meeting the needs of the young people, actually we're meeting the needs of an administrative bureaucratic threshold. So we really want to see a rapid change to that.
And we also really need to tackle the bureaucratic process that is the education, health and care plan process. And I think that is, that unless we tackle that, then we are invariably just going to go around the same track. I'd really favour looking at a digital approach to education, health and care plans that makes them more visible, raises the bar of accountability, but also would significantly reduce an administrative burden, simplify, and I'm absolutely sure that we will speed up the process, but we need to tackle that ultimately. Because at the moment, we've got schools, we've got local authorities, we've got parents all seeking to fill the gap until resources released. But these are children, these are learners who have been part of the school system for a while. They don't go from nothing to an education, health and care plan. So there are strategies in place. There are approaches that schools are doing, and at times we're seeing it's almost a point of last resort for a school, really seeking to find something, a solution, and we need to really de-bureaucratise the education, health and care plan system.
And can I just add to what Annamarie said about, it's not just also digitising, standardising, because we know that there's a challenge around the different systems.
I'm really sorry. We've got loads of topics that we want to get your evidence on the record, and the question was about how we support families while they're waiting. Okay. So I'm going to move on. Is there anyone else who wants to come in on that topic of how we support families while they're waiting?
Just very quickly, I think just around family support is so critical, and especially I would flag those early years. The earliest settings are the most trusted professionals that work with families, and if we can get it right there, it is all about that celebratory approach. It's about when a child is needing that support, that we're working with them to show this could be the future, to look at that positively, because certainly in those early years, that's where you'll set the path for how those parents think about what the future could be and what potential there is. And I just think that moment is one that sometimes we miss, and we do need to really invest in making sure that those parents get that quality. And a lot of local authorities have had portage cut, and it's one of those things that you really need to look at and say, how are we supporting those families early so they're moving into the education system with hope that inclusion is possible and that they've got hope for the future.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to Mark.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a question for all of you, but I think we might start with Catherine, if that's okay. Is the DFE's definition of an inclusive mainstream education clearly defined across early years, across schools, across further education? And if it isn't clearly defined, if you don't think that, how should it be defined?
So, definitions. I hear a lot of work going on in different places to define what inclusion is. I know that's important. I think for me at the moment, and for the experiences that we have in the early years, What we really want to see is a situation where the local authority, the settings and the families have a shared understanding of what inclusive practice looks like. At the moment, I would say we don't. I think that comes from a lot of different levels. Obviously, it comes from real co-production with families by local authorities and including families in those discussions. But it also comes from a respect from the early years settings as well, to listen to them when that is being discussed, and that they're often missed out. With Childcare Works, we've just designed a new sort of reflection tool to really understand, is this inclusive, is it not? And so settings can use that, families will be able to access that as well. And the DFE also launched the Early Years Assessment Guidance, which again is about trying to standardise what we would do in settings, what parents can expect. And then of course the holy grail of all of that is our ordinarily available provision. And again, we really, really want to encourage the DFE to consider having an OAP guidance that is standardised. So there may be tweaks for different local areas, but actually we need to have an agreed understanding of what provision looks like, of what we want children to experience when they're in our settings. Without that, it's not just that settings need that support to say this is exactly what we need to offer, but it's also that parents will then read that. The number of parents who've come to us and said, my child's too difficult, I know they're not going to be able to succeed in early years in a setting, so I've kept them at home, because of course that's the difference between the early years and school. They don't have to go to an early years setting. But actually once they see, for example, an ordinarily available provision, and we share that, and everybody should be sharing that with families, they're like, oh, actually, if my child had all of this support, they'd be absolutely fine. And so without that knowledge of this is what every setting should be providing, and this is how your child will be welcomed, then they may not put their children into early education. So, yeah, I think that I won't give you a definition because it's so difficult, but those are all the things that need to be in place.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Yeah, please go ahead, Annamarie.
We have DFE in the hot seat, and ultimately they are leading education. Inclusion goes much broader than education, goes beyond the school and college gates. It's a wider society definition. So I see at nasen we would say that inclusion is also much broader than SEND. If we're really talking about an inclusive education, then we don't start identifying that as only for SEND. We do say it's often the SEND learners who are not included. So it's much broader. It takes account of wider vulnerabilities, and in this context here today we're talking about inclusion and SEND. I think we retain that wider framing, and that we don't stop at a definition, because it's about the implementation. It's active, and it's going to be continuing to evolve, and it's going to look different according to the starting point. And we've got to make sure that everybody feels that they can play a part in inclusion, even if their starting point isn't as developed and refined as another setting.
But it is surely the point that in a system that has such little trust and confidence from parents, if what we're shifting towards can't be properly defined, there can't be proper accountability, and it will be very difficult for that system to attract the confidence of parents in that context.
Yeah, I think we can have very clear measures, and we can have measures that come from the voices of children and young people in the system and their parents too, about the confidence and how they feel, the sense of whether they feel that they belong in a setting, whether they're included, and whether there's a curriculum that is right for them and their needs and their talents.
Okay. Please go ahead, yeah.
And I think the point that was being made around, is the DFE's current sort of framing, and I think we get mixed messages, don't we, that actually simply having high numbers of children with SEND in school and not in specialist settings is somehow indicative of inclusion. And I know that the DFE are very keen to move forward with that definition. We see inclusion as a process. It's not a static thing, as Annamarie said. It's, it should be a verb, really. And actually, that process is what schools really need the help with, to consider what is it, what's the shared understanding that we have across schools, but also with families, about what that process of improvement looks like. And my clarity on that would be that actually the end state that you mentioned about is belonging, is thriving, is achievement, is attainment. but actually how you get there is inclusion. And that's what we need to be clear about. It's that participation, that engagement, and how a school supports that, and how a local area supports that, and how we work collaboratively. And I think we get a little bit confused about trying to define what a static state of inclusion looks like. And it's constantly moving. But in order to get to belonging, we need that inclusive, systematic process within our schools. And we'll mention the graduated approach later on, but it's a helpful tool for that systematic process.
Thank you. Any final thoughts?
Just to agree that it's the right ambition to have the majority of children and young people in mainstream, but that's only one part of inclusion. The sense of belonging that ministers actually often talk about is absolutely what we need. And for further education, inclusion as an end game in terms of their destinations, their movement into adult life, are they being included in society and employment as in terms of social and community across all the preparing for adulthood outcomes. That's important.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Karen.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. So I've got a question for Annamarie. What challenges do education settings face when adopting a whole setting approach to inclusivity? And what steps do you think could be taken in the setting and by the local authority or the government to help overcome these challenges and improve inclusivity?
So the challenges, essentially, it takes time. So they need to work as is and have a vision for where they want to be. And it takes investment in staff at all levels. So whether it's the SENCO, or whether it's the class teacher, whether it's the governors or trustees, they all need to be on board with a whole school, a whole setting approach. Thinking hard about what the specific barriers are, because obviously I feel very strongly that is the best and most strategic approach. But I'm aware that the barrier is sustaining and time and juggling the competing pressures. And to have a whole school approach that is fully inclusive does mean working against the tide sometimes with the current accountability measures that we have in place in the school system. It means being a brave leader and doing what's right for the school rather than what might be seen as the approach that would be favoured if there was an inspection, for example. There's some brilliant examples of schools that have transformed at secondary, how they run their year 7. So really thinking hard about how transition points can be quite challenging for some young people to manage, and it can amplify particular characteristics that are then interpreted as negative and behaviour. So some school leaders have really transformed what they do at year 7. They haven't diluted the curriculum, they just structure and timetable differently. So it's that attention to being able to rethink how one is actually leading a school is the challenge, because it can mean taking a tougher path, and it can mean also being very brave and supporting staff when they're maybe questioned and when the vision isn't always fully understood. So that's essentially the biggest challenge, but I'm confident that some of those challenges will reduce if we get some real positive traction with the curriculum and assessment review.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Darren.
I think it's very well acknowledged that the current Ofsted system does not value inclusion properly, and that actually what the unintended consequences that you do get schools adopting exclusionary practices because of what they're measured on. So maybe starting with Margaret Mulholland and then opening out, I'd like to hear from you how you think the incentives in the system can be shifted so that we can actually properly promote and celebrate inclusive practices.
Yeah, I think any accountability system drives incentives, and we have many perverse incentives at the moment. You know, the focus on attainment and performance and comparison across the system puts a tremendous, as Annamarie said before, tremendous pressure on school leaders. And I think the ambition of Ofsted to look at inclusion is welcomed, But I think we have concerns that actually in wanting to celebrate inclusion, we need to be really careful about how the mechanics of that are unpicked and explained and shared, and we'd like to see the department playing a role in that and Ofsted actually checking that rather than leading on the articulation of that assessment framework. So at the moment it looks like inclusion is going to be a judgment woved through the new proposals for the inspection framework, which we think could be really positive rather than a bolt-on, rather than a separate. But we are very concerned about the continued perverse incentive from a 5-grade inspection. We're also concerned about admissions and inclusion as it's described in the new proposals, which was, is not at odds with attainment. So the way in which the proposals from Ofsted have been framed, it looks as though we will be only able to judge inclusion within the school and not make judgments particularly around the representation of the local area and the SEND needs in the local area, because Ofsted doesn't look at admissions, and we'd like to think about what are the ways that we might ensure that schools reflect the needs of their local area, the SEND needs, the inclusive needs of the local area.
Thank you.
So we are working with Ofsted on what that looks like in the early years. One thing I just wanted to flag was actually around the Ofsted area inspections and the need to really look at, because often early years comes off very well in the inspections, but actually there's a need to sort of shift that slightly to say actually the issues we're seeing in primary schools, and that's what's then being fed back to the local authorities, how much of that could have actually been addressed in the early years, because at the moment that longer term look at it is not really happening. So what we need to be doing is saying actually if something's happening in primary, how much of that could have been addressed in early years, which would have then solved the problem earlier. So it's about saying those area inspections taking a longer term view of where those issues are starting and then potentially what actions could be taken.
I think it is welcome that Ofsted are looking at inclusion, but we need to look at the right metrics. As I said before, the breadth of learners with SEND, too often they're judged on, FE providers are judged on level 2 attainment, for example, instead of looking at different metrics for independence, for self-regulation, for confidence, for sustained employment. We'd really like for that breadth to be looked at.
And just to add briefly, we also need to look beyond the sort of Ofsted as a single lens, that there are many other modes of improvement support that happen within the world of schools and colleges. And one example from the programme that we're working on at nasen and Natspec are also involved too is peer-led SEND reviews of provision, and we're organising those at school, at college, and with some great results. So we need to be more fluid in thinking about what does inspection look like in the future, and so not solely through an Ofsted lens, and be able to take just a perspective of improvement from many different sources.
Just really quickly, finally, the worry for FE colleges, that as I've said are already quite inclusive, is that if the funding system isn't looked at, 16 to 19 funding system, you'll find potentially more colleges looking at their entry-level provision or their non-accredited provision and saying, actually, that's not cost-effective for us. So that's the concern, lack of SEND support, lack of programme weighting, to make sure that we can retain the inclusive system that we have already in many colleges.
In about no more than 10 seconds each, because I realise we've got to move on, if you could recommend one element to be added to the inclusion criteria that Ofsted are going to be doing, what would you recommend that would be? And maybe start with Catherine and go along the line very quickly. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I would be asking settings what percentage of children with SEND do they expect and are they business planning for?
Okay, thank you.
I would be really keen to hear from young people's voice and to make sure that that's really firmly embedded in inclusion.
Brilliant, thank you.
I think the progress in school improvement terms, so we welcome the scorecard, how does a school move toward inclusivity and how is it representative of its community?
I'd like all three of those, and I'd also like for FE settings to be judged on destinations, appropriate destinations across a range of factors.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Amanda.
Great question, Darren. Thank you, Chair. Mine's mainly to Margaret, but obviously the rest of you feel free to contribute. We've heard that all SENCO should be part of a senior leadership team to strengthen the influence and support that is given across schools. Firstly, do you agree? And secondly, are there other immediate changes that can be made to support SENCOs within the current funding? And thirdly, outside of the current funding, if there was more funding available, what would be an immediate solution for SENCOs to be supported?
Thank you. Yes, we do think they should be on the senior leadership team, that SENCOs should be both senior and strategic, so enabled to represent SEND on that senior leadership team. We also think that roles and responsibilities have to be much clearer and exemplified across the system so that leaders know their roles, middle leaders know their role. What we see in really good practice is not SENCOs locked in their office being responsible for SEND pupils, but actually SENCOs working with class teachers, building confidence, developing their practice, making sure that middle leaders are driving inclusion, instigating a graduated approach, not to apply for an EHCP, but doing that assess, plan, do, review throughout the school so that every player in that staff team understands their role and responsibility and has confidence and notices and makes relational connections with those young people. So senior and strategic, but actually driving that whole school approach. In terms of what's needed and what we could do now, I think the pipeline is not good enough at the moment. We need more schools being able to train their SENCOs, and they need more beyond the MPQ. So within every MPQ, we need more SEND lens and SEND training. But SENCOs need to be, schools rather, need sometimes to be training a SENCO and have a SENCO in waiting. You know, they need to be enabling core staff to have the skills to move whole school approaches forward, and that distributed leadership model is really key to that. If we had additional funding, what would we need for those SENCOs? For that additional capacity to be part of community clusters so that we can really upskill and up-level the expertise in the community.
Thank you. Anyone else wanted to hit you?
Sorry.
No.
Okay. Just to say that in FE there's no mandated requirement, and that's very logical because there's often teams of staff that need to fulfil those functions. The scale is much bigger across multi-sites, across multi-local authorities, and what those staff need is a reduced level of bureaucracy. That, as I said before, the localised system is very difficult for colleges. They often work with 5, 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30 and above local authorities. So the bureaucracy about EHCPs, the updating of EHCPs, the late decisions about EHCPs, and sometimes those local authorities sending colleges hundreds of consultations to apply within 15 days. Those are the pressures that colleges are facing. Sort of the SENCO role is needing to be spread.
And only just to really briefly add that SENCO's roles have become much broader and that they are often the key person for a whole range of pastoral responsibilities for the school, including, you know, pupil mental health and so on. So it really indicates that there's need for more pastoral support within a school, whatever the title and however that's framed. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks.
Thank you. So a question for Annamarie and Margaret. The updated initial teacher training and early career framework includes new content on inclusive teaching. Could you just tell us very briefly whether you think this is sufficient and what improvements could be made to teacher training to better equip educators in supporting children and young people with SEND?
Yes, it is an improvement, but there's a long way still to go. So we need more enhancement of each of the areas of the standards, both ITT and ECF. One of the particular positives, I think, is that in Section 5 of the ITT framework, we've got what's vital for some is valuable for all. That shows a real culture shift in the way we're thinking about what's needed for all. I think also the mention of support for young people from their start points, which is in both frameworks, that has a huge implication for the way teaching and learning is developed, and we need more inclusive pedagogy. And what I mean by that is we need to be enabling teachers to make good decisions about how they support young people, and we need to bed more into assessment sections of the standards, both at ITT and ECF, because that formative assessment is really important for that inclusive teaching. At the moment, we've got a set of, these are the to-dos that you do as an effective teacher. What we need to be able to do for inclusion purposes is enable those teachers to make those good decisions in relation to the child in front of them and ensure that child can make progress. And we need to build the confidence and competence of those teachers through those frameworks. So I think the next steps are really exciting, but the frameworks need to be enhanced with more of a SEND lens in each of the areas of the standards, not just adaptive teaching.
And of course, fundamentally, it depends on the teaching practice and the experience, and how those frameworks are actually led and supported. So we have to influence those who are leading the teacher education to be inclusive in their language and how they deliver. So good intent and good work to the framework, but we absolutely have to do the follow-through so that we don't see inclusion as an add-on or an optional extra, that this has to be, we need a teaching workforce that comes out of their initial teacher education believing that an inclusive classroom is what they're expecting to see, and that is part of their remit rather than an added extra. So that's really crucial. And then I don't think we'll ever be able to have somebody leaving their initial teacher education and their first couple of years in early teaching topped up with everything they need to know. The commitment to ongoing professional development is absolutely essential.
Thank you.
Manuela.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is for Annamarie and Margaret. What measures can the department or individual education settings implement to upskill teaching assistants and other support staff to improve the support for children and young people with CND?
On teaching assistants, I'm delighted to say that teaching assistants have actually participated in the Universal SEND Services programme that we've been delivering. They're not excluded, they are included. We obviously have particular targets to achieve in terms of reaching school leaders and class teachers, but teaching assistants have been engaging with those programmes. There's online units which are self-led in one's own time, short, bite-sized. They've been very popular. With teaching assistants who've then been able to select the time when they can actually engage in those. Just as an example, over 23,000 participants have accessed those online units, and that's across around 17,000 schools, and that's included a significant number of teaching assistants too. So I think it's understanding that they don't all bring the same underpinning knowledge that a teacher who's leading the learning will have. However, some of the training is absolutely entirely appropriate for them. And separately to that, ensuring that they do have career pathways that are really taking them to whichever level they can progress to, and we see good examples of that in a number of schools, and in particular in the Multi-Academy Trust. There's a lot of good school-led support for teaching assistants. The flip side is that they're often time poor and don't have enough opportunity outside of the classroom to be able to, well, it's in their own time quite often accessing the training opportunities that are there.
Can I just add one point, which I think is, an example of what Annamarie has been just saying, but the new apprenticeship model based on the levy for specialist teaching assistants is really, a great opportunity for that career development. And we need to be able to reward those teaching assistants. We can't hold those teaching assistants in schools without those development opportunities. We want to enhance their practice, but we also want to reward them financially.
So we are almost completely out of time, and our next panel of witnesses, who are young people with direct experience of the SEND system, have arrived in the room, and we really want to make time to hear from them. Can I just bring in Serena with a final question, which is only for Catherine, really quickly, if you can?
Yes, so
you.
Bearing in mind the unique challenges that are being faced in early years SEND sector, could you briefly just share, solution focused as well, some of the changes that are needed at a settings level or local authority or national government?
I'll be as quick as I can. So I think the really big difference between the early years and the rest of the system is that sufficiency is a really big issue. And so at the moment, only 6% of our local authorities think they have enough places for children with SEND in the early years. There are key challenges related to this. One of them is around workforce development and training. So we currently have just over 20,000 learners on our inclusion training. And when they finish the training, 97% of them say they can take more children with SEND. So what it really shows is that it's knowledge, but it's also confidence. And we've got to really build that knowledge and confidence within our early years workforce. Within settings, we need to make sure that there's not the over-reliance on one-to-ones. We know that one-to-ones don't lead to better life outcomes, so we really need to look at enhanced ratios. And again, that strong inclusive practice that makes them believe they can take more children and support them effectively. It's really, really important. Funding issues, we really need to look at the way funding comes in. Funding is often very slow to come in the early years. And so for settings, they will often have a child come in, then they start to go through the process to get that funding. So they're funding that from their own money, and we know our early years sector is not particularly well funded, and that's becoming a barrier, and that a lot of settings are starting to turn children away. So we know that 35% of settings report having turned children with SEND away, and families are also reporting that as well. So we have to really start to change that. We've also got lack of accountability, which is again to do with the earlier sector is a lot of businesses. So it's quite different to schools. So often local authorities will say we can't hold them to account because actually they're businesses, so we don't have the same power we do with schools. But now with the increased funding for early years entitlement, we need to switch that around as well. So our childcare sufficiency assessments that every local authority has to create, they do not have a good section on SEND. The SEND section simply says we have SENIF funding and DAF funding. We need to get to a place where those CSAs show supply and demand specifically for children with SEND, because at the moment they don't. And there are lots of ways to do that. We've created papers for that for Childcare Works. And then the last thing I would just say is also, again, it's just that lack of value of the sector. So we just need to turn that around. We need to make sure that when we make decisions in government, we don't make a decision and then say, oh, hang on, how's that going to affect the children with SEND? Because it seems like a lot of changes in the early years that what happens for children with SEND has not been considered, and it's only afterwards we start to work it through. And often, for example, when we increase entitlements, provision for children with SEND goes down further. So we really, really have to look at children with SEND centred on whatever we're going to change in our early years system.
Thank you very much indeed. Apologies that we are out of time. Can I thank all of our witnesses for coming to give your evidence this morning? And also, can I just say, if there are any points that you felt you didn't have the time to get across today, please do feel free to write to the committee afterwards and let us know about those things. We do want to hear all of your evidence, and sorry that we were a little bit pressured on time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Order. We are now resuming our evidence session. This is a session of the Education Select Committee on our inquiry Solving the SEND Crisis. Can I welcome to the committee our witnesses who are giving evidence in the second half of the session, who are young people with direct experience of the SEND system, either current or recent experience. We are really grateful to all of you for giving up your time to come and give us your evidence this morning. The reason that we've organised this session is because we want to hear from you directly. We know that no reform or changes to the SEND system will be any good at all if they don't directly improve the experience of children and young people with additional needs and disabilities. So we want to put your voices really at the centre of our inquiry, and we are very, very interested to hear the things that you want to tell us this morning. Please feel comfortable around the table today. Help yourself to water. If you need to step out for a moment and take a break, that is absolutely fine. And if there are questions that we ask you that you don't want to answer, or you feel you just haven't got anything to say about that particular question, please feel free just to say that, and don't feel any pressure to answer any of those questions. Can I say before we start that, and I should have introduced my name, so I'm Helen. I met all of you on the Zoom calls before we had this session. Our members will introduce themselves, members of the committee, as they ask you questions. One or two of them may need to leave the room at different times. That is just how it goes with members of Parliament. They sometimes have other commitments, and the chamber will be getting underway in a little while as well. So please don't think that that's anything to do with not being interested in what you have to say. It's just sometimes what needs to happen. And we'll let you know if that does happen. And then the final thing to say by way of introduction is that the bell will ring. A bell will ring at 11:30, and it will ring twice in quite a short space of time. That is just to mark the start of the House of Commons chamber sitting at the beginning of the day. We don't need to do anything. We can just carry on. But just so that isn't something that startles us all when it happens. That will happen at 11:30 on the dot. So can I start our questioning now with a nice open question for all of our witnesses. I think we'll just go round and maybe start with Joanna, but can I ask all of you just to introduce yourself, to tell us a little bit about you and about the types of SEND support that you've received through your education.
Okay, I wrote some things on my phone just to keep myself going. So yeah, I'm Joanna Hall. I'm a 21-year-old autistic graduate from the north of Sheffield. I feel like that's quite important because when things come up later, like the economic disparity up there significantly impacts the STEM provision. Come with the ambitious youth network, but also coming through not the lens of not just autism but physical health disabilities, as I've got a chronic migraine condition, as well as mental ill health, because I had some time out of school in year 11 for a psychiatric ward stay. I feel like I have quite a unique experience of education because of the comorbidities. Not that it's unique to have comorbidities as an autistic person, but that the education experience was perhaps a little bit out of the ordinary, particularly as I spent the majority of my time in education not knowing that I was disabled, so not being aware and not having any of the provisions put in place. So had to experience school through a neurotypical framework due to a lack of diagnosis, which meant that I obviously was heavily misunderstood and misunderstood myself. So I didn't receive a diagnosis of autism until 15, and I wasn't diagnosed with any mental health conditions or physical health conditions until the same kind of time. So for me, the majority of primary and secondary was in mainstream, and it was experienced as though I wasn't disabled. So I didn't really have much SEND provision. a couple of things were picked up. So I did at times, I can hand it to teachers that I think it's a good example of you can meet needs without somebody being diagnosed with a disability or diagnosed with anything, because everybody has sensory needs, everybody has communication needs. So for example, like when I was in Key Stage 1, I got taken out of class to support my special interest and to help regulate my emotions. Then secondary school was just sort of was hell, really. I think particularly because of the fact that social rules become more complex, as opposed to when you're in primary school. They're quite simple. They're quite, somebody might say, do you want to be friends? And that's it, you're friends. Whereas it's a bit more of a minefield. And I think particularly when I think maybe female friendships can sometimes be a bit more complicated too. And then also I think the background of the fact that we were in quite a deprived area, the actual SEN provision was so depleted. It did get picked up at one point that I was struggling with my mental health, and I did have some in secondary school, and I did have some support to leave class, but it was essentially to go to like an on-site unit, which was like honestly like almost like a ruin. Like it was really not well taken care of. The people in it felt like nobody quite cared about you if you were in there. Like there wasn't, the staff there did the best they could with what they had, but they didn't have much. And I believe we only had one singular SEN trained professional in the entire school. Bear in mind there was about 1,000 of us. And then I had experience in specialist education, so I ended up in a psychiatric unit, and there I had experience in the hospital school, and that was wildly different. Very, very small classes of like 2, 3, only core subjects, much quieter, much more almost like primary school kind of outlook on things, which has its ups and downs, so not super academic, which for me I missed that, but was also a lot simpler. You had very structured days, and then I went to, after I was in that school, I went to another alternative provision, but that was in the community, and that is still around now, but I think it's become an academy actually, and that was a similar kind of experience. And we did get through the GCSEs, and we had like an individual learning mentor and everything. So, and I think where SEN picked up for me and where the provision got better was the diagnosis, but also I think the fact that my parents were, because my mum was able to, we had enough money to be able to comfortably, or at least not struggle too much, as my mum becoming a carer, because she could no longer, so she was no longer providing. My dad became the full breadwinner, and in the area I was from, that for most people that is an impossibility. So I was really quite lucky, and we're not like massively well off, but we've I know for a fact that me being disabled has meant an extreme loss of income and a lot of stress on the family income. And then, sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, but quickly, college and university, I have to say college was absolutely fantastic in their provision, really brilliant. But I think that's because it was so recent, my hospital stay. University again was brilliant, but I don't know if the difference is because it's paid for provision. I don't know why that difference is there. So I don't want to talk too much because
that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Lucy, can you introduce yourself, please?
So, hello, my name is Lucy Bowerman. I'm 22. and I've got a variety of different SEN diagnoses, but the one that impacts me the most is autism, which I was diagnosed with age 12, but I do believe it could have been picked up quite a bit earlier than that. I'm also the co-chair of My Life, My Choice, which is an Oxfordshire-based learning disability self-advocacy charity, and I've been there for a couple of years, and I'm also an Oliver McGowan autism co-trainer as well. And then in terms of SEN support, so I'd say my journey was quite rocky. I started off in a mainstream primary school, which I'd say I did pretty well in. I thrived with the routine, all of that was quite good, but it sort of all fell apart when I transitioned to secondary school. Still not yet diagnosed at that point, ended up in autistic burnout, ended up sectioned. So after that, I then had experience of education in a mental health unit, which wasn't wonderful. It got me an EHCP though, which did help things. After that, I then spent a period out of education, which happened quite a few times through my journey, unfortunately, as it was really, really tough on, I think, all of us to actually find the right provision that met my needs. So I did go to an autism specialist school, but I think there were difficulties with that because I was always considered very academic and quite a high achiever, and at that school there wasn't much of a focus on education, which I think was quite challenging for me because all I wanted to do was just sit down and get on with it. But there was a lot of disruption and stuff, so that didn't work out. I then spent sort of periods in and out of education, and that sums up for me really.
Thank you. Katie.
I'm Katie, I'm 17, I've got autism and PTSD from the education system. I guess it starts when I was 5. My parents spoke to the GP referred me to CAMS. CAMS said we're not going to see her and just sent my parents to parenting classes, so I carried on through primary school, had bits of intermittent struggle, but was mostly coping all right till I got to year 6, and the pressure of SATs was so overwhelming that I dropped out, had complete autistic burnout, could not cope in school at all. That experience gave me PTSD, but I wasn't diagnosed till much later. I got referred back to CAMS then, but the waiting list meant that I started secondary school before I got my autism diagnosis, so there was no real support going into secondary school. Secondary school was really overwhelming. I went to a busy mainstream school with so many pupils, it was so loud. I dropped out again, had complete autistic burnout, got diagnosed with an eating disorder, my mental health was really low, went on alternate provision for a while, tried to go back to mainstream school and couldn't, so I tried 2 different schools. They weren't SEN special schools, they were just private schools, but I couldn't cope in either of them, even though the environment was a lot better. So dropped out of school completely, got diagnosed with PTSD, and I'm now on education other than at school.
Thank you. Sarah.
I'm Sarah, I'm 20, and I'm a final year student at university. And as for my SEN journey, I've got multiple lifelong conditions and stuff, and I got an EHCP when I started primary school, and the support at my primary school was absolutely brilliant and things, but like a lot of other witnesses here, it was when I started secondary school that support all started to fall apart, because yes, I still had the EHCP, but there just wasn't enough support for me, because it turned out being things like the staff not giving me a TA in PE, or like my predicted grade happened to be lowered because I wasn't getting the right support. It was things like that, and then 6th form, yes, the support was much better, but it then all changed when I was in the end of year 12, when I lost a lot of eyesight, and it just, when I started 6th form, I did have a QVTI, but then it was when I lost my sight that that just went in a way. And yes, I had like some mobility training and things, but like within the 6th form itself, the support was brilliant. I can't fault it and stuff. And now that I'm at uni, the support is really good. I've got disabled students allowance, and within that I've got assistive technology software and non-medical help. But then the uni themselves have also put additional adjustments in place. For example, all classrooms to be on the ground floor, all materials to be in large print, all that sort of thing. So again, my SEND journey has been a bit rocky, but overall it's taking the secondary school bit out of the equation. It's been a mostly positive experience.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. And can I just say for the record as well that our colleague Darren Paffy has left just while you were speaking, Sarah. Madeline.
Good morning, I'm Madeline. I am 19 and I'm currently in my second year of university. I am here because my provisions related to me being autistic and because I had ill mental health throughout the education system as well. I was diagnosed as autistic when I was about 17 years old, but I had started off on that pathway from about the age of 13 through the help of CAMS, which was brilliant. I knew that there was particular elements that I struggled with when I was younger, and at about the age of 10 I became quite vocal about it, that I knew that there was something that wasn't exactly the same as my peers, and it distressed me not knowing what that was. And so I did research into mental health conditions, which I later found out that I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety through my experiences within the education system. And I didn't get particularly many provisions until I had left mainstream education. I, at 14, had to leave my secondary school and go to an online schooling system called Interhigh, and that was the best thing that happened for my education because I was able to learn in my own environment, and it took me away from the busy and stressful and struggling education system that I was in at the time, that couldn't help me and wasn't able to give the support through different issues within their teams. And all the way through my primary and secondary experience up until I was able to go to an online school, I had a particularly difficult experience. I had really struggled with my mental health throughout, and I had to then leave because I wasn't able to get into school. I was having panic attacks and sensory overload consistently, and I would spend most of my day sat outside the classroom while teachers had passed me in the corridors, thinking that I'd done something wrong, that I was sent out for being a troubled child, when it was just that I couldn't cope in that environment. And that judgment, I think, affected me even more. However, I went to a mainstream sixth form to do my A-levels, and it was, I think, the best best schooling experience that I had ever had. And it really gave me the confidence to be able to go on and go off to university to live by myself. And it was the support that I found from teachers who either knew firsthand or were particularly empathetic and person-centered with their teaching, or through the friends that I had gained through that experience who really supported me, that gave me that confidence. And I went from barely passing my GCSEs to excelling in my A-levels. Now I am at university and I have had difficulty, but I have definitely had more support after gaining an EHCP when I was 14 that my mother applied for. She was told that there wouldn't be a likelihood chance that if you were a parent applying for it, it would be a massive struggle to be able to get me that support, but it managed to get passed through because she'd been able to detail exactly what issues that I'd had throughout mainstream education and what I needed, and then with that support going on with the HCP and then further on a DSA when I got to university, it has definitely been a massive help.
Thank you. Amanda.
Thank you, everyone. My name's Amanda Martin and I'm an MP down in Portsmouth. and just want to say thank you for sharing your experiences. I want to just ask a couple of questions around that, and just if you can elaborate further. The first one is, and I think some of you have touched on this already, but was the SEND support you received right for you? If not, what more could have been done to get it right? And I think a second part, because you might want to just talk about this together, is if there were delays in getting that support, whether it was right or wrong, what impact did that have on you while you waited? So was it the right support? If it wasn't, what could have been done better? And if it was delayed, how did that impact on you? Should we start with you, Maddie, this time?
I, as I've sort of briefly explained, really didn't have much support until I was outside of mainstream education, and that was something that my parents and I had to fight for quite drastically to be able to get me that help and for me to be able to pass my exams. I do believe that, especially from how vocal I was about my experiences and how much I was struggling when I was younger, the issues that I was having could have been noticed earlier. And I think that if they had, I possibly would have gotten much more support, and I may have been able to have stayed in mainstream education. However, I don't regret the choices that I made leaving, because I think that was right for the time, and I don't think that I would be in this room today if it wasn't for that experience. I would wish that, with these circumstances in mind, the teachers that I had who were able to support me within smaller classroom settings, like primary school environments where we had about 10 kids in a class, would have had the resources within the school environment to be able to have listened to me when I was struggling, and that when my mum would have brought up the fact that I was struggling to make it into school, complaining of being sick, not wanting to go into school and wanting to be homeschooled from about the age of 6, 7 years old, that they had been able to listen and empathise and recognise that it wasn't a child messing around, it was someone who was really, really struggling. And I think if I'd had a different experience within the primary school environment, my entire life would have been different.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to wait for the bell? It won't stop. It'll ring again, won't it?
It will go again in a minute, yeah. It'll be like 3 minutes, so carry on and then, yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
So for me, it's like, hang on, would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, so it was, do you think the right support, you received the right support? What could have been done to make it right if not? And if that support was delayed, what was that impact on you?
I think, for me, all of my teachers throughout my whole education experience have been brilliant and always understanding, because I've had to spend a lot of time, I was in and out of hospital all throughout my childhood and things like that. The support at my primary school, I would say, was really good, and they all understood and things like that. Secondary school, not so much, because I wasn't getting the right support that I needed, and I had to rely on my friends a lot to help me, and I felt quite, I don't want to say embarrassed by having to ask my friends to help me, because I was like, I just want to be able to spend time with them as friends and not as my TAs or support workers. And it's just, and again, sixth form, the support was really good and everyone understood, TAs and teachers alike. And same at university, my support workers have been really good, as have my lecturers. And yes, there have been a few support issues that I've had, including my sight guide and note taker leaving a few times, and there have sometimes been delays in when they've managed to find someone. For example, last term there was a period of 3 weeks, I think it was, where I was without anyone, and my friends all had to come to my lectures and help me to take notes and things like that. And I just feel so self-conscious about asking people to help me in things, because I want to try and be as independent as I can, but I know sometimes it's going to be a difficult struggle and stuff like that. And throughout primary school, secondary school, and even uni now, I would say, like, I felt a bit, I don't want to say self-conscious as well, but also a bit embarrassed, because my sixth form, I had 2 friends who were also visually impaired, and the 3 of us all had long canes and stuff like that. But at primary school, secondary school and uni, I haven't seen many, or if any, students with a visual impairment. And secondary school especially, I was quite, I don't want to say reluctant to use my cane and stuff, but I just felt so that I was the only one, and I don't want to say I felt left out, but that's sometimes what it felt like. And at uni, I mean, everyone, because I lost my eyesight when I was in the middle of sixth form, so people there knew me with sight and without it. So, like, I've had a long cane for, I think, 4 years, I think. I might be wrong about that, but like, I don't feel as self-conscious using it at uni as I have done elsewhere, because everyone at uni has known me without eyesight, and okay, not totally without it, but it's just basically sometimes my friends have had to act as my TAs or support workers, and it's just not, like, that doesn't feel right to me, because I just want to be able to spend time with them as friends and not as support workers. And at secondary school, a lot of the time my teachers have to double up as the teaching assistant for there not being the support when I was in class, or there being, for example, 1 TA to 5 students, and it was just things like that, really, that sometimes the support was good and it was there, and other times it was not so good, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much, Sarah. Katie?
I think overall my SEND support, it's alright now, but it wasn't for quite a while. When I started struggling in year 6 of primary school, I wasn't diagnosed with anything, but my parents did manage to agree some accommodations with the head teacher, but those were then ignored by my classroom teacher. She just decided not to listen. And then I just kept on struggling, dropped out a lot, and then my mental health was really bad moving into secondary school, but there wasn't any transition support because I still wasn't diagnosed with autism by then. I think my parents got 1 extra meeting with the secondary school people, but that was it. I was kind of just thrown in the deep end, so to speak. And then when I started struggling at secondary school, I did get my autism diagnosis and did get an EHCP then. So the support got a bit better, but I was still unable to cope. My support right now is education other than at school, and that has worked really well for me because I just can't handle being at school at all. In terms of delays in support, the main delays are just waiting for diagnosis times, and then I've had many changes to my EHCP and many different EHCPs because I was moving provision a lot because no one could work out why I couldn't go to school. So every time you need to get a change with your local authority to the EHCP, you're stuck waiting for such a long time because there's always this back and forth and they don't listen to you, and there's always communication delays, and it just takes such a long time. Even if you are in crisis right now, there's nothing you can do, you're just stuck waiting, and that takes such a big toll on families because you're having to advocate for yourself constantly. Yeah, I think that's...
Thank you, that's really helpful, Katie. Lucy?
Yeah, so, I mean, whilst there were a few things across the journey that I think people did get right, I think myself and my family would agree that I was completely failed by the system. So there are so many things simple things that could have been done that just weren't. And I guess it's all right to offer somebody support, but if you're not offering them the right support, then what's the point in doing it? Because you can actually cause further trauma and further damage to people with not doing that. And then in terms of the delays and the impact that had on me, I mean, the biggest impact was actually spending prolonged periods out of education. I mean, I have learned that in the SEND system there is a lot of waiting around. There are a lot of periods where nothing happened. So there was a period where I changed local authorities at one point, and I think my mum called up the EHCP people maybe a year after I'd moved back to see what was going on with my EHCP, and we were informed by our local authority that my EHCP was actually still registered in that county that I'd moved from perhaps 18 months earlier. That was in 2022. We're now in 2025, and we still don't know what's happening with it. Obviously, an EHCP does run up to the age of 25, so I should have 3 years left on it, but we've got no idea where that has gone to, and chasing the council doesn't seem to work for that, unfortunately. So yeah, that's the impact. I mean, it's also significantly affected my mental health, and it did at various points, because being left with periods without education, with nothing to do, you just sat at home, and that made my anxiety so much worse. I mean, there were points where when I was in the specialist school, I was starting to go out on my own and things, but as soon as I came out of that setting, I think I sort of just withdrew again, and I had to learn to do all of those things over and over again. So it did have quite a significant impact. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucy.
Joanna? Yeah, I think, would you say the question again?
Yeah, so it was the SEND support that you received right for you? What could have been done to get it right? And I guess if there were delays in getting it right, how did that impact on you?
Yeah, okay, I feel like during my time at secondary school, we didn't really know that, I didn't particularly know that mental health and my migraine condition would have been classed under SEN anyway. So that was not something that we would have pursued, because there were so many other things going on in the family that to pursue that would have been an added burden that there didn't seem much point in anyway. And it wasn't quite clear. I don't think it was quite clear until I became malnourished that there was such a significant problem happening. So when I did finally get support, it happened really quite quickly. I received the majority of my diagnoses in hospital within about 3 months, which is very quick for an autism diagnosis. Once I got that, the school, mainstream school was not comfortable with being able to support me. I think they were, particularly, I don't think they knew quite how to support a recovering anorexic patient. I don't think they didn't feel like they had the facilities to do that, which is probably quite correct. I think they should have had the facilities to be able to do that, hopefully, but they obviously just didn't. But the support afterwards was mostly quite positive. I think I'm very glad I managed to get it in time for my exams. So one thing, so my OCD is a lot better now, but at the time I was of my GCSEs, one of the things that made it quite difficult was making sure I counted every letter of each word, and then every word in a line to make sure it was a certain number, so it didn't something horrific didn't happen. So that was really distressing and took a lot longer. So I did get extra time on my exams, which made a massive difference. I had a teacher who seeing physical time and numbers was upsetting, and she was quite happy to just turn that the other way. But I think that is just a case of there was often either the same number of staff to pupils or potentially even more, but that is simply just because it's a specialised school. So I think my experience of specialised schools is fine. It's when they're mainstream not being able to cope, and I think that's probably because they can't cope with everybody else, let alone the added disabilities.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. We'll go to Mark now for questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name's Mark Sewards. I'm an MP from Morley, which is in Leeds. I have several parts to this question, but you've already answered the first part very well, so feel free to focus on the second part. And I will mix it up a bit with who we go to first. So, what were your experiences in mainstream and specialist education settings, and how could this have been improved? And secondly, how could schools make sure they meet the needs of all their students, regardless of ability, background or need? And on this one, I'm happy to start with Katie.
Okay, I have a lot of thoughts about the inclusion one, about how schools could meet the needs of all their students regardless of abilities and backgrounds and needs, because I just don't think it's possible. Mainstream schools in their current state, I don't think it's possible for them to meet the needs of every single student correctly. There's too many people with too many different needs. If you're in a classroom with one teacher to 30 people, it's not possible for that one teacher to be adequately looking after the needs and meeting the needs of all 30 students. And there's another thing that bothers me about the way the term inclusive is being used now, because something that is inclusive to one person may not be inclusive to another, and using it as a blanket term just removes the nuances and the fact that people are individuals with needs that may conflict with each other. You need to acknowledge the individual in the inclusivity. General inclusivity is not going to work overall. You need to teach people how to kind of work with the people who are right in front of them. If you're training teachers, broadly is okay for some things, but to some extent you also just need the teachers to sit down and have a long chat with each pupil and kind of understand what's going on with them, and mainstream schools just do not have the resources to do it at all. What else was on the question, sorry?
So anything that you think schools could do to improve. So let's say, as you've articulated very well, you don't think inclusivity works. What would you suggest?
Well, I think being inclusive is a good thing, but just the latest terminology for all of it just makes it into more of a blanket term rather than more individual. To improve support, I think the teachers need to really be on top of what's going on with each young person or student in their class and really understand their needs. But with the current class sizes, I just don't think they can. So smaller class sizes would help some people. Smaller schools overall, school is really overwhelming. It's just sensory overload constantly. And often people are just too busy to kind of look after you is the other thing. So it's like, I need help, but they're too busy right now. There's no one right there for you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And if you have further input, I'm very happy to take that later on as well. Can we go to you next, Sarah?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Of course, yeah, it was quite a long question. I'm happy to repeat it as many times as you like. What were your experiences in mainstream and specialist education settings, and how could this have been improved? And the second part is, how can schools make sure they meet the needs of all their students, regardless of ability, background or need?
Like, one thing for me that, I mean, the whole support system for me has been really like anxiety inducing, and I already suffer from anxiety, so the uncertainty of whether I'm going to get the support or not has been like really anxiety inducing and has really taken a toll on my mental health. And it's just, and as for meeting the needs of everyone, one thing that I really think is important is language choices, because what might be considered acceptable for one student is different to another. So, like, for me, for example, I'm, like, because of my visual impairment, I'm not a huge fan of sight-related language. So, for example, okay, I know it's not in this context, but if someone said, do you see what I'm saying? Like, I know it's not, I know in that context, see isn't what you would, what it normally means, but it's still things like that. That's, so, like, off the top of my head, that's one of many examples I could give, but it's things like that, just making sure your language is accessible to everyone, and also, again, making sure you know your students as well. Say you have like a main teacher and then a trainee teacher comes and teaches a class, like, make sure the needs of every student are passed on to that teacher, if that makes sense.
It does.
But like, for me, the main thing over a lot of my education journey has been the language accessibility, and again the uncertainty of everything, of knowing what language the teacher is going to use and whether I'm going to get the support and stuff like that has been really anxiety inducing and had a massive toll on my mental health, but not just for me but also for my family as well, because the fact that they're having to sit there and watch me have the uncertainty of not knowing, and I guess it's I know it's me receiving the support, but I guess it's uncertain for them as it is for me, if that makes sense as well.
It does.
And having the whole, I already suffer from anxiety, and so I know I've said this about 50 times, but it's been really anxiety inducing and has had a massive, massive toll on my mental health.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Go to Lucy next, if that's okay, Lucy.
Thank you. So I think I'll touch more on my experiences in the specialist provision, as already spoken about the mainstream. I think one thing we need for a start is more provision for people who don't fit in either the boxes of mainstream or specialist education. So for me, mainstream didn't work. I struggled too much. I mean, the secondary I went to was, I think it was 1,600 students, so absolutely massive, chaotic, very busy, lasted less than a year there. Waited a couple of years for a specialist autism school, and again, I lasted, I think, a year and a half in that maybe. I found that there was, for somebody who is very academic and wants to just put their head down and work hard, there was a lot of disruption, a lot of people who would rather mess around than engage in education, and I would say there was also a significant lack of focus on actually learning things. I mean, a lot of it was, there would be a lot of disruption in the classroom, so what they would do was give me my book and send me out of the classroom, me who just wanted to sit there and get on with everything. So I'd be sent out of the classroom to wander around the building, go and sit in an attic room, or just sit and read my book. And in the end, that unfortunately just didn't work out for me. And what was the second question, sorry?
So the second part of the question, you've answered the first part brilliantly. How could schools make sure they meet the needs of all their students, regardless of their ability, background or need?
So I think my first point on that would be flexibility is the most important thing. I mean, for me in my life in general, I need a lot of flexibility and I need to be quite flexible as well. So just around curriculum and things, perhaps some subjects might not work for some students, and rather than continually drumming into them that you need to do this, it's part of the national curriculum, you have to learn this, you need this for life skills, maybe thinking about actually, if they are finding that subject that difficult, what are they gaining from being forced to sit in that lesson? Is there something else, is there some sort of vocational course that actually might work a lot better for them, that might not only give them life skills but significantly improve their well-being? Because surely having good mental and physical health and having life skills is far more important than some random math skill that you might actually never use again. So I think considering things like that is important. And then also, if people do need support, it's listening to them, listening to their families, and listening to relevant professionals involved as well. So somebody might, so this is how I appeared, they might appear to be absolutely thriving at school, but you never know, when they go home, them and their family might be having to deal with the consequences of them masking all day, of poor mental health, of absolutely melting down when they got home. So it's just considering things like that and actually, listening to the person and their family, because you don't know what goes on outside of the school setting. Someone isn't at school 24 hours a day. There might be other things happening for them. And then I think also just remembering that every person is their own unique individual, with individual needs, individual likes and dislikes, and it's around tailoring things to that rather than insisting that people conform to social norms and fit into silly little boxes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lucy. Next I'll go to Joanna, if that's okay.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with what Lucy said about kind of like the lack of academia in like specialist education. It's a missing one, and I kind of understand why, because I don't think people know how to manage behaviour potentially of people with special educational needs, but it's kind of either assumed you are uninterested in academia, or it's like, well, you're not smart enough or whatever, you're kind of from a troubled background or a troubled neighbourhood or whatever, so you're not, there's no interest for you either. The school I had when I was in the psychiatric unit was very insistent on a lack of academics, which I can totally understand why. But again, I think you need to be considerate of what works for that particular person. I think there's a lot of assumption that the reason people are unwell is it's exam stress. Young people have a lot more things going on in their lives than that. Significantly, the majority of people have a lot more going on in their lives, and for some people that might be the case, and that's okay. But you need to not. I think it's like, don't make the assumption of what's going on there, because for me, that is the only thing I've enjoyed about school is the academics. Socially struggled, communication, sensory element of it. It was hell. So to take that out of school was just like, well, you've kind of taken anything good out of it. Why would you do that? I think in terms of making things better, I think having more options for people and considering what that particular person wants, but also not having to be diagnosed with something to have your needs met. I think every child has different communication needs, and every person does too. There's no, I think I have like a couple of good examples where I have had people consider my needs without it being, oh, well, that's your need because you have autism, or that's your need because you have OCD. It's just like, that's how you learn better. But I do understand Katie with like mainstream school is not equipped to deal with SEN effectively, but it could be if it is lack of funding. But I think another thing is kind of how the focus on league tables is a massive issue, because they all the teachers are so stressed by it, which then bleeds into the children, and you have so many tiny things are penalised, like uniform, lateness, very small things, and I think it was so frustrating when I don't know if anybody's familiar with the poem, but I Ain't Got a Pen.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that for me, like, yeah, you'd get to school and genuinely, if you didn't have a pen, that was like detention kind of thing. And it was like, I've done this all morning. I've tried my absolute hardest to get in, and I haven't got a pen, or I haven't got this. And so I think schools also need to be a bit aware of the environment that they're in. So what the context they are in, what kind of people go to your school? What are they generally dealing with? I think our school was like 60% free school meals. So for example, they know that as a statistic. They therefore should know that finances are a problem. So if schools take into idea what the context that they're existing within, and we move away from the academic focus and the league tables, I think that would be beneficial.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Madeline.
I would like to start off by hammering home just everything that everyone has said for that question, and re-emphasise just how important flexibility, empathy, the aspects around a school uniform, like Joanna was saying. I had a particularly difficult time with a new school uniform that came in. We went from comfortable jumpers and clothing that was particularly easy for sensory issues to, within a couple of weeks, having a whole new school uniform which required ties, blazers and jumpers and all sorts, and it was really distressing having that change. And then going from having an entirely new sort of regulation around what you were wearing, having to then get used to that within a couple of weeks, and also learning to do a tie for the first time when I was 13, 14, and that being really stressful, and how other kids would mess around with those school uniforms. I remember seeing kids pulling on each other's ties because, oh, it's a new thing, it'll be fun. and the amount of stress that that caused. And I felt like the new school uniform was choking. And it became really, really difficult for me to be able to engage in that environment with all of the noise, with all of the busyness, and then that on top that we'd have school uniform checks going straight in through the door to every class, and you had to have the top button done up, tie all the way done up, and it would be really overwhelming for me. And despite the fact that my parents had said that I was really struggling in that environment and needed a little bit of flexibility and leeway, it was consistently met with, but she has to behave like all of the other students, that we can't accommodate that. For something really simple as just not doing the tie all the way up, which you wouldn't think for a 13-year-old should be a problem, particularly. It's not the biggest aspect of education. And that ended up being met almost every day by teachers who were saying, well, you know, you need to accommodate to what we've been told, that the foundations and the federations have been told us, that has to be sort of regulated across the board, because if you don't, then we'll get in trouble. And I'm empathetic to that, but that control and the pressure to conform even to, from league tables to uniform, then does really impact students negatively to that conformity, especially when it's not something that they find easy, and especially when they have other needs alongside that then isn't being taken into account because the teacher's then overwhelmed and worried about their position.
Yeah.
And I think that is the heart of it, just empathy and being able to recognise that despite those rules and regulations, each child is a separate individual, and each child needs to be taken into account as a whole person, rather than a statistic, or to conform to exactly the same way that every other student does. I also had difficulty getting into the classrooms, and I was told that I could be on a limited timetable for certain amounts of subjects I couldn't get in for. However, tutor I had to be in for. That it was desperately important to my education that I missed geography, but I had to be in for tutor. And that ended up being the final straw for my family and taking me out of it, that education system. Because for the one unstructured part of the day where sometimes our teachers struggled to control the classroom, I still had to be present in an environment that didn't work for me, where I had no friends, no support system, and no escape. And yeah, it's just about taking that into account, taking into account the fact that every child is different, every child does have different needs, and to take each situation as individually as you possibly can.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
So I'll go to Caroline in a minute. We are at 12 o'clock. I will let this session run on for another 15 minutes until about 12:15. I think that's what we briefed all of the witnesses might happen. But as we're asking the questions, if you feel that you've already answered the question because you've been giving really full answers to our questions so far, please don't feel that you have to say it again. We've captured what you've said already, and that will help us to get through all of our questions by 12:15. But I am going to go to Karen, who's got a question on a completely different topic now. So thank you.
Hello, my name's Caroline. I'm an MP from South Devon, right down in the West Country. So I'd like to ask you about the school curriculum, and what, if anything, do you think, how do you think the curriculum could be changed to be more inclusive? And if you think that any changes to the curriculum wouldn't make any difference, then please say so. But we'll start with Joanna.
This one I actually really struggled with when I had a little look at it, because I was kind of like, there's a lot of things I could think of for changing the curriculum, but not necessarily in regard to SEN. A couple of things I did think of off the top of my head was sex education being disabled friendly, so actually including aspects of, for example, when you're disabled you are more vulnerable to sexual exploitation, more vulnerable to being groomed, and that is something that's not really mentioned. I think if we had more kind of in-depth understandings of how relationships work, because I think, you know, as an autistic person, that's a really difficult thing to kind of understand. So to really break those things down and have that in-depth teaching throughout being a young person. I guess perhaps some actual education on disability to teach other students. I think there was a child in our class in primary school who everybody knew. I think children kind of know when a child has additional needs sometimes, but don't necessarily know what it is. But they're like, you know, I know that person needs extra help. We'll look after him. When you're little, not when you're a teenager, that doesn't happen. When you're little, it does. And there was one time when the teacher kind of sat down and explained, you know, he had a different brain to us. So I now know that he was autistic, but they explained it in a way that was quite like friendly for us, to help us understand that. And I think that would be really helpful to do throughout secondary school. It's a really difficult one because I don't know how do you actually change the culture of secondary school children. That is, I don't know.
That's a whole other question.
Yeah, that's a whole other question. And I don't know if the curriculum is something that can be done with that. I think, sorry, just one last thing is, one thing that I think was really cool that we did that I think could potentially be a good thing is they gave us an opportunity to do like a little project on something totally, you know, we got separate credits, but totally outside of the curriculum, just like on whatever we wanted, like absolutely anything. So we just, you know, go ham on a special interest kind of thing. And that was really good. You didn't have to do it, but like that as an example of just like, this is something you can really like get your teeth into, whatever you want, could be about anything.
What did you choose?
Hieronymus Bosch's painting The Garden of Earthly Delights.
Wow. Thank you.
Really fabulous, thank you.
Madeline.
When I was first looking at this question, I started thinking about it more from the perspective of what do people have to learn around disability and SEN. And it made me think more towards the actual teacher training than anything else. And I think that going back to the how do you change the school culture, I think that starts with the people in positions of authority. I think that starts with the teachers themselves and about their approach to things. And I don't think that we have enough teacher training or effective teacher training within looking at disabilities and SEN and how that then affects the students. Alongside that, I think that can then trickle down through things like PSHE and working on people are going to be different. I know that I had a massive lack of PSHE when I was going through the education system. It wasn't something that was particularly included or was neglected. And I think it would be really interesting to see it from that perspective, working with kids and speaking about differences and acknowledging that and being able to teach them how to have empathetic conversations. And also, alongside that, looking more towards the way that children learn and what could be effective within the curriculum for disabled children and young people, the possibility of having more flexibility within how they tackle the sort of classroom activities or the homework that's accredited to them. And instead of saying it all has to be done within a very specific standard of this essay, especially in younger years, I think it'd be really interesting to see the change that could come from having children go off and find their own ways of displaying that information for themselves and having more flexibility and freedom to perhaps, if there is an overarching theme on sea life, for instance, how does the child want to then display that information, and how can we make the projects more accessible if they, for instance, are struggling with communication difficulties, or if they're particularly passionate about one specific medium, having them figure out what they want to do, and then having them be able to understand their own creative identity through that. And I think that will also help in workplace environments, where we're seeing a lot more around flexibility and creativity in corporations, and how that could then stem into young people going into the workforce and having more freedom to figure out how they want to display that information, how they can have fun with the work that they're doing rather than it having to be within a strict guideline.
Thank you. That's brilliant. We're going to move on now to Sarah.
Would you be able to repeat the question again?
We're just wondering how you think the school curriculum could be changed to make it more inclusive. More of anything, less of something?
I think for me it's mostly been accessible, but there's just a couple of things for me that have been particularly difficult to access, and one of those for me was some of my GCSE physics lessons. And because for me, one of our units, I think, was basic. I can't remember what the official title was, but something to do with magnets, basically. And because of my medical conditions, every time the teacher did a practical, I had to go outside the classroom, and it just felt like I was missing out on not only the social aspect of it, but also the learning. Because I was in the COVID year, meaning all of my GCSEs were based on predicted grades. But if I had have actually sat my GCSEs, that could have been some vital information that I'd missed.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And
thank you.
That was the main one for me. But it's also things like online learning that, because of my vision difficulties, that like anything online based is just difficult, full stop. And it's things like for teachers and lecturers and all of the academic staff, just making sure that their modules or topics or whatever they're called are accessible to everyone. And I know I keep coming back to the example of my vision, but it's things like a lot of my modules and stuff have been really visual. And yes, I know everyone's tried to not reduce it as much as they can, but try and make it as accessible as they can. But I've still really struggled with that sort of thing, and it's just trying to make the language not only accessible, but also a bit more descriptive as well, in terms of trying to describe what the topic is, and just basically trying to make everything accessible in terms of what module you're teaching and basically parts of that. Because again, the whole having to stand outside the classroom thing with my GCSEs, and even in PE lessons when it was, because again, for me, because of my medical conditions, PE definitely is not the safest of subjects. So a lot of that I have to spend outside the sports hall, or basically not participating, and it was just, it felt so isolating as well. So it's just, and again, that took a real toll on my mental health.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Definite anxiety.
Katie.
I think what really needs to change is less exam focus, and particularly exam drilling, and then also attendance focus, and then seeing those things reflected in the way Ofsted looks at schools. Because for my primary school in year 6, the reason they were putting so much pressure on SATs was because they needed to get the results up to show to Ofsted, and clearly that came above our mental health and well-being of the pupils, the students who were actually in the school. And that's now resulted in me barely having any secondary school education as a long-term effect. So I think it makes me much more focused on the fact that schools' job is to set up this young person for life. It's not to get good exam results, it's not to force them in every single day. This is a young person who's going to go out into the world someday, and how are you giving them the best chance at doing that, in whatever that means to them. So probably changing the curriculum to be more focused on what they want to do. As other people said, if they're not enjoying a subject, there's no point forcing it. It's not going to happen. And just really making sure that people feel free to learn in whatever way suits them and how they'll learn best. Because just forcing the same method, it's not going to work. You're just ending up with more problems by forcing it.
Thank you very much. Lucy.
So I think I've covered most of this already, to be fair, so just a couple of short points. I think we need less of the one-size-fits-all, you have to follow the national curriculum, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. I think we need to get rid of that. It doesn't work, and that's not just for SEND students. I think that doesn't work for a lot of people. And so I think moving away from that strict approach would be helpful. And then also having individualised curriculum plans for anyone who is struggling. So that's whether you've got a diagnosis or not. And that can include things like reduced or adapted timetables. Something which we did do at my specialist school, which did help, which was having sensory and movement breaks. So we had a 10-minute period between each lesson where we could wander around, have sensory breaks, and things like that were really helpful. And then also just designated SEND staff to help deliver these things, so if that's in a smaller classroom setting, something like that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Serena now to ask our last question. I think we've answered the other ones as we've gone along. So
wonderful, and thank you. So as we come to the end of today's session, which has been so beneficial and helpful for all of us here to hear your experiences and insights, this is an opportunity for you to think of something that you may have not said or mentioned. So if there was one more thing that we can go away and tell this government that will help other children and young people with SEND, what would that one thing be? So I'm going to start off with Lucy.
I think I'm going to keep it short and sweet, but listen to people like us and listen to their families. And when you do that, you will start getting all of the information you need, and then to go from there with that.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. Joanna?
That's hard. I'll come back to you.
I'll come back to you. I will come back to you. Madeline?
I would say to, like you're all doing today, to keep young people within these conversations and to keep listening to our voices and to have us within those decisions.
Okay, thank you, Madeline. Sarah?
Yeah, I agree, and I guess just like get to know them and see what they want, because it's not like the discussion shouldn't be about them or like talking to someone or about them if they're in the room. The conversation should be with them, like Lucy and Madeline have said, make sure you listen to the young people and include them in the conversation. Within that, don't just talk at the young person or about them as if they're not there, but make sure you listen to them and talk to them as well, and make sure you get their opinion on what they, because it's about what support the individual wants. So I guess listen to the individual and make sure you include them in the conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. And Katie?
Same as everyone else, youth voice at the heart of all SEND services and functions and everything, including that young person. But also, local authorities need to stop fighting families and start working with families and young people. Just constantly saying no, pushing back, trying to make it difficult. We all just need to work together on it, because fighting's not going to help.
Thank you, Katie. And Joanna?
Don't leave the working class kids out of it, because I think a lot of people here will probably can say, you know, my mum's been able to fight for me, my dad's been there. There are a lot of people who, you know, in my area who their parents are illiterate because of poverty. So and they'd not be able to advocate for themselves.
Yes, they don't have the same support networks. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much indeed. Can I say thank you again to all of you for coming this morning. You've been incredibly clear and articulate about your experiences and about what needs to change in the SEND system of support, as well as some of the things that have worked well and been helpful to you as well. We were really keen to do this session in public, so the session has been broadcast. The session will be on the public record as part of our formal evidence for this inquiry, so your voices really are at the heart of everything that we are trying to do with this inquiry, and that is really important that you have that status within it. Your evidence today is incredibly helpful to us, and it will directly inform the recommendations that we make to the government when we get to the end of this inquiry. So thank you very, very much. I realise it's a big deal to come up to Parliament, and there's been a lot of preparation that's gone into today, and I'm sure it's been not always a kind of very easy thing to think about doing and to anticipate. So thank you so much again for coming today. It's been really important that you did. Thank you.
Thanks to the families that have enabled this.
Absolutely,
well,
and to the
people
organisations that have supported as well. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Order, that brings us